Well, hello everyone. And today we have something very special, which is I said in a video a while ago that I feel almost like moral obligation to proselytize for Gene Wolfe. And so like even if I read obscure books by him, it's like I still want to talk about them, even if 10 people watch it. And a couple months ago, my friend Jay from A Contemplative Reader and I were chatting, and we discussed reading a Gene Wolfe book together. So, for those of you who don't know Jay, I'll let him introduce himself and then we'll talk about the book for a bit and go from there. So, Jay, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Sam, for the invitation. I will say that when you are promoting Gene Wolfe, it is righteous promotion, righteous proselytizing, I would even say, because Gene Wolfe needs to be more widely read. So,
That's
more
right.
power to you. So, again, my channel is a contemplative reader, relatively new channel, just started this year. I bring in my background as a pastor in the Lutheran Christian tradition and my experience in the spiritual life and various traditions to the table. And Gene Wolfe and among other authors, Gene Wolfe has been a primary source of inspiration on my channel because there is so much historical, spiritual, mystical content within his books that I think I'll be, as long as I have my channel, I'll probably be reading uh, some of his books and talking about it. And Sam, you've been certainly an inspiration to me to keep going down the Gene Wolfe trail.
Hey, well, that's good to hear. And I'll take a quick digression before we get to the main topic. I'd like to shout out a subscriber of mine. Actually, his name's Matthew. Um, I did a video just going over my Gene Wolfe collection, and he was like, "Hey, I've got a couple books of Wolfe that weren't in your haul there. If you want, I could send them to you." And I'm not going to do a full like show off thing here, but since it's a Gene Wolfe related thing and it's the next Gene Wolfe related thing, and I just got his package the other day, I want to say like thank you, Matthew. Very, very kind of you. And I don't know how to respond when like, people are kind like that. But one of the books not included, because I already had a copy, was this. This is The Devil in a Forest, um, which is what Jay and I are going to be talking about today. I I think I just found this on Wolf's like Goodreads page as one of his like lesser read novels and did a little bit of looking, and it's like, okay, this is like among the first few books that he wrote. Um and when Jay and I were chatting, we were like, "Oh, I think you had just picked up a copy of it." Um so we were like, "Yeah, that's right. So let's talk about The Devil in a Forest." So yeah, Jay, I guess a couple of if you could do a couple things here. One, if you could say briefly what the book is about, or at least what you got from it, and kind of some of your initial thoughts. And we'll start spoiler free, although I don't think many people watching this are going to be super worried about an obscure Gene Wolfe book getting spoiled. But I'll have you start off with that.
Sure. The book has an interesting backstory. It was written in the 1970s, and Wolfe had been singing the Christmas carol "Good King Wenceslas," which is the story of a young uh, lord who was living in Central Europe in the 900s AD. And there's a story of this young page or young man who was with the good King Wenceslas as he uh, is helping out a poor person. So, and it talks about this young page in the story. So Gene Wolfe had the idea: what if I wrote a story about a young man living in Central Europe in the 900s? What his story might be like. And so The Devil in a Forest is this basically a historical fiction story about a young man named Mark, uh, 900s, roughly in the area of Prague in what modern day Czech Republic, in this tiny village with just a few people, but lots of exciting things come up. This relatively boring life for this young man, but all of a sudden he's dealing with this Robin Hood like roguish character named Watt, who's a person who roams the forest, also dealing with Mother Clute, who's this purported witch who lives in the forest nearby. Various other characters in the story, a priest in town named Abe, and he encounters all of these characters. There's soldiers that gets involved. There's this mythical character who supposedly lives in the forest that gets involved, named the Barrow Man. Uh, it's again, it was marketed as a fantasy, I think, but it's really more of a historical fiction. I think there are some low elements of family in it, a low grade fantasy elements in it. But I think if historical fiction is more your bag, this book could definitely fit into that. So that's kind of a very rough overview of the story. Lots more details we can get into. My initial thoughts are I thought at times I thought I wish I would have read this Gene Wolfe book first, perhaps before. It's a very low. It's not as an intensive a reading experience as Book of the New Sun, for example. There's still a lot of classic Gene Wolfe elements in it that you can find and discover, and we'll go over some of those. But in terms of just reading it and being able to understand what's going on at your first crack of it, this was a somewhat easier read, I found, but nevertheless enjoyable. What did you think?
That's a good question. So it's one of those things where it's like kind of what you're describing there. It's like a low resolution version of a Gene Wolfe story, and something that we'd messaged about a little bit is that there's a lot of elements. It's not really true. There's a lot of themes and ideas that are played with here that you'll see expanded on and explored in a bigger way in Book of the New Sun, which is the main reason why Wolfe fans will read Devil in a Forest now. Is not just because it's like, oh my gosh, the most mind blowing. Like, did you read Devil in a Forest? The most mind blowing Wolfe book you'll read, but more to see like here's an early prototype of like what Wolfe is going to be working with. And so I get that. I've got to say, as far as my overall thoughts on the book, having read close to 12 Wolfe books by this point, I'm trying to count them in my head. This one's probably my least favorite of the ones that I've read. I don't think it's bad by any means, but I think it's probably the first Wolfe book that I gave 3 stars to, and that has nothing to do with craft or skill. That's purely like an enjoyment metric for me. But that's not to say that there aren't a lot of things that I think other people will enjoy. Like you said, it's a very small scale story. If anything, because you mentioned it's not really a fantasy story, even though it's kind of marketed as such. I mean, yeah, literally, like on the side, it actually says like, it's published by Ace Science Fiction. It's like, you know,
Right, and my copy says so. It was published in 1976. This is a reprint from 1981, right after Charlotte Torture came out. It says right here, a superior and beautifully told fantasy by the author of Shadow the Torture and the Fifth Head of Cerberus. So, and then the back cover, which describes a little bit of the story and some of the characters, it really emphasizes, probably to the point of exaggeration, the fantasy elements of the story regarding Mother Clute, this supposed witch-like character, the Barrow Man, this awesome spirit of a long dead warrior, and the young man Mark, not yet totally seduced by evil, not yet totally convinced by good. And I think so. Where fantasy publishing was in the mid 1970s, you think about it. So they were still world dominated by Tolkien and the reprints of Robert E. Howard, Conan, and other Howard properties. You think of historical fiction or fantasy, which borderline with historical fiction, such as Guy Gavriel Kay, and even some of the really George R.R. Martin. If you take away dragons from Game of Thrones, there's not a lot of fantasy elements in that one either. More of a historical retelling of War of the Roses. That hadn't come along yet. Those were in the 80s and 90s. So I think publishers saw this and thought, what is this? Well, he's a writer of science fiction and fantasy. We're still going to stick the fantasy label on it.
Right.
And it sells. So even though it really wasn't fantasy, again, more of a kind of a very tightly focused historical fiction. The so they kind of came up with this pulpy even cover. It looks like a heavy metal album cover from the
Right.
19 Ronnie James Dio or
Right.
something like that. And doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the story, but that's just kind of the where publishing was, I think, in fantasy in the 1970s and early 80s. So yeah, and also as we alluded to a little bit, in terms of where Gene Wolfe was in his career, I did look it up, and this was his fourth novel published. He had published Operation Aries, Fifth Head of Cerberus, Peace, and The Devil in a Force. This was 1976. He didn't publish another book again until Shadow of the Torture in 1980. Of course, he was still working full time as an engineer at this point. So he probably had, it took him longer to obviously, and I think he intended to publish all the Book of the New Sun as one book instead of separately, I suppose, is why it took him 4 years. But yeah, I think you can see where he took the elements of this book and turned it into a full-blown, science fiction, fantastical saga that was Book of the New Sun.
And it makes sense why the book is marketed this way. But like you said, it's pretty low fantasy because it's like, what's the story about? It's about, it opens with this peddler coming to the town and then the peddler getting murdered. And like everybody kind of knows that it's this, like you said, Robin Hood like character Watt. Everybody knows that it's him. It's like, okay, what do we do about Watt? It's going to create trouble for the town. It's like, okay, we'll form a village militia to go take care of him. And then that kind of goes back, that kind of goes like sideways, and people start dying. And so then, like you said, the king's troops start getting involved, and things get even worse as it compounds. And so it is much more of a grounded, small story. So in terms of the marketing of it, it's like, bravo, like you caught the attention of Gene Wolfe readers with your cover, but it's not necessarily indicative of what the story is. Not in terms of scares, but in terms of the tone and scale of the story and some of the tropes. It almost reads more like a horror story than it does like a fantasy. What came to mind to me, and I don't know what your familiarity is with this guy, Jay, but it reminded me of the movies of Robert Eggers, who made The Witch and The Northman and Nosferatu. Like it, where you have like Eggers has this obsession with, even though he's doing like horror movies for the most part, he has this obsession with like being accurate to historical detail. And there's a similar thing going on here with Wolfe, where what he's telling is, at first glance, a fairly benign, low-level historical fiction story about a young boy in a very, very tiny village with a very small conflict that's going on. And yet there's lots of little details about the time and how things would work, where Wolfe is kind of showing off his expertise there. And anyway, as I was reading it, even in my own mind, I was like, this kind of feels like a Robert Eggers type of movie, but in a book form.
Yeah, I hadn't connected it to him specifically, but I can see where you're coming from. What came to mind for me was the Vikings TV show from, I was on the History Channel, whatever. I think it's still being produced in some fashion on Netflix, because it mostly focused on the characters from this village, but and mostly just historical fiction with some liberties taken, but some fantastical elements grafted into it of the supernatural relating to the gods in that story, or in this case, I don't know when to get into this, but again, being the self-appointed theologian of BookTube, there are some very interesting things that I think are going on with regard to Wolfe's incorporation of religion into this. Particularly, this is right at the cusp of Christendom reaching Central Europe, or at least this part of Central Europe. Still a lot of pagan elements in it. There's this group, as you mentioned, called the Charcoal Burners, which is kind of this pagan group that lives out in the forest surrounding the village. but Christianity has reached the village because there is a priest monk that lives there. There is a chapel. There are masses and religious services there. But there's still a definite influence of paganism in the region. One particular element of that is there's a statue that's out in the charcoal burners camp that there's a question: is that the Virgin Mary, or is that the goddess Freya? It's been painted over to look like the Virgin Mary. What's going on there with that? And then there's this pagan shrine called the name escapes me. It's got the cross in the title of it. And so again, is that a pagan relation, or is there a Christian theme going on with that? So again, lots of I wrote down some of the religious symbolism I was finding, or not nearly as much as in Book of the New Sun, or any of those books, or even some of the short stories of Gene Wolfe that I've been reading from the Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories compilation. But you've got things like, kind of revolves around, again, going back to Wolfe getting the idea for this story from the hymn, classic Christmas hymn, the Good King Wenceslas. There's a reference in that Christmas carol to St. Agnes's fountain.
Yeah.
So a lot of the story revolves around the presence of St. Agnes's fountain in this village as a pilgrimage spot and a primary source of income for the area. Pilgrims would come to this area to be healed by the waters of this fountain, much like today in France. There's Lourdes, which where the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared in the 1800s, and people go there to this day to be healed by those waters as sort of a shrine or a pilgrimage spot. Well, you can imagine in the 900s Central Europe, the different people that would come around seeking to be healed in this place, and how that could be quite a coup for the people of this village. So there was an inn and some other small aspects of an economy built around that. So that's kind of a major part of the story. And I reminded other Gene Wolfe stories, such as Book of the New Sun, where he brings in St. Catherine. There's kind of a whole element of St. Catherine's feast day revolving around the story. So here you have St. Agnes involved in the story. There's other just little connections to the faith and to Wolfe's other writings that we can get into. Overall, I thought, if I can kind of pontificate for a minute, I like the story. I think for probably the first 3/4 of the book, I was along the lines of you. I thought, this is not up to standard of what some of the other things I read by Wolfe, and I haven't read nearly as much Wolfe as you have. Just the first half of the Book of the New Sun, several short stories, Pirate Freedom, or what I have gone through so far. But then I came to really love the story in the last part of it, because I think I figured out part of what he's doing, at least in my mind, what he might be doing. Of course, Gene is no longer alive for me to ask him this question. I wish he was. But I think he's really he's writing this, again, as I said, depicting a historical fantasy of what's going on at the beginning of Christendom in Central Europe, 900s AD, Christianity's taking over. And he's writing this from the vantage point of 1970s Western, United States, towards the end of Christendom. And the advance of the secular state, post-modernity, and all these things. And even though he writes this, and he writes the depiction of the villagers and the experience of the story where there's sudden violence involved, people die. There's not justice. Innocent people are caught up in this, and bad things happen to them. To invoke the old Thomas Hobbes quote about life during that time, life could be nasty, brutish, and short. And Gene Wolfe depicts that quite well. But on the other hand, I think that this book is really an ode to the beauty of what you might call the mystical, the weird elements of, I don't mean that as a pejorative, elements of Christian faith as it was back then. You've got saints, you've got shrines, you've got weird, um, you know, mystical experiences. You've got all those kinds of things. So you've got a priest monk living in a town, and that really came through to me when, again, no spoilers yet, but there was a funeral mass, I think in the second to last full chapter, where Gene Wolfe is describing what's going on with again young Mark, 14 years old, observing what the priest monk in the town, who'd become a close associate of his, and he's describing in such loving fashion how this mass's funeral, the burial, created, taking the wood, making the caskets, doing all these rites, the burial.
That's right.
Mark doesn't understand Latin, but he recognizes enough of it to know there's Latin going on. So Gene Wolfe, I think, is if I understand right, think of sort of some of the things like Beowulf, for example, was
Right.
written Christian perspective about, but sort of almost of a nostalgic for a prior age.
Yeah.
A loving ode to what had transpired before. I'm imagining Gene Wolfe writing this in 1976, post Vatican II. The Latin Mass is no more. The weirdness of, again, I mean that lovingly, not pejorative,
Yeah.
of the Catholicism kind of diminishing right in front of his very eyes. Again, a devoted Catholic as he was, the elements of Christian faith, kind of in flux around him. I imagine him longing back for that earlier age when it was just people living in a village. The chapel was the central point of town. The faith, as it was developing in that time, being a primary source of inspiration and both in terms of their, not their spiritual life, but their common experience or common life as well. So those are things that all pop through my head. And of course, once something like that gets in my head, then I immediately love it, just because that's the way I am. So anyway, that's my pontification about the book, about why I ended up liking it more than I did for most of the book. So for what it's worth, if I don't know if that might help anybody or not, it might just be something peculiar to me and why I like certain stories.
You touched on something that I think is really a real like key point of like what Wolfe is dealing with here, which is you said you talked about this statue that's with the charcoal burners, and it's like, okay, is it this like idol? Is it an image to Mary? What is it? It's not really clear. And that's one of the big themes in this book especially is ambiguity of identity. And that is the case with almost every character, where at different points you will question, okay, like, are they a good guy? Are they not? Like, there's questions of like, wait, did this person from our group sell us out, or did they not? Like Watt, who's one of the main forces of the book, there's a lot of questions about like, is he just sort of a neutral force? Is he good? Is he evil? What is he? And of course you get answers as the book goes along, but there's a lot of questions about, and even beyond just like, is he good or bad? Like, who is this guy even? And even with the main character of Mark, there's a certain amount of ambiguity there because we'll just say like Mark is the protagonist, but also falls in with some really bad people, and even is sort of like a companion in some of the evil that is done throughout the book. So that ambiguity is something that Wolfe is playing with there. I guess at this point, I'll give one last thought, and then we'll go full spoilers. I'll say, I don't know if I would recommend this as a good intro book to Wolfe. Jay, it sounded like you might almost, just because I think that there's better books of his that I've read that I've enjoyed more. But if there are people who are intimidated by the complex reputation that Wolfe has, has. This book is relatively straightforward, at least on the surface. It's pretty simple to understand. There's like 6-7 characters to follow, so it's not a big cast, and it's really short. So if what we're talking about at least sounds interesting, yeah, I mean, pick it up. But if you want, to go for the real challenge, I think there's other books of his that are more impactful and that mean more to me personally. So Jay, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but we can get into spoilers now.
That's fair. Yeah, I think you don't come to the end of it and feeling totally wowed by the experience and of what you might get normally from a Gene Wolfe book, or have the kind of profound insights that you might normally get. But for sure, I'll have to think more about it, but I would be okay recommending this as an introductory book to Gene Wolfe if they're looking for a more traditional story and they're not wanting to have to think an overly think a whole lot about what the story is as they're going along, and keeping track of characters and timelines and all those things that can be involved in some stories of Gene Wolfe. But yeah, that's I would have a little bit more positive thought about that than I think you might.
And I guess I should clarify. I don't want to come off as negative about the book, because I'm not. I just think I'm maybe not as positive as I have been on some of his other books. I will say one thing that I really liked in the book is he does some really interesting things with the Abby character. And there's a few things that I'll touch on there, but Jay, specifically and I actually had to go back and re-look at it because I missed it the first time. But what Wolfe does with the epilogue, with the Abbey, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that particularly.
I do. That's very interesting. Are we in spoiler territory now? Or
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, all right. So at this portion of the recording, all bets are off. But as we discussed, realistically, you people probably won't care as much as that, as really in any Gene Wolfe book. I think they aren't really spoilery type books, with a few exceptions. So the epilogue reveals I presume to be present day tourists coming across this shrine, this St. Agnes fountain, and there's an inscription on it which has to be translated, but refers to, again, spoiler territory here, towards the end of the narrative involving Mark and Abe and all these other Watt and these other characters, there is a skirmish, a minor battle, and it ends up that it appears that Mother Clute has put some sort of a hex on him, or done something witchcraft to him and causes him to lose his eyesight. And there's reference to that in the last chapter, when there's sort of the trial of Watt and some other characters. And on this inscription in the epilogue, again, these modern day people are reading it. There's a reference to how this number one, the Abe was canonized as a saint at some point, because it's referred to as saint. Gene Wolfe doesn't give us the name, but whose eyes were healed and ended up performing many more miracles. And so I thought, yeah, very, very interesting, and kind of a minor version of what Gene Wolfe does with giving different perspectives and different time frames.
Right.
He does that in the story itself when Mark is reflecting back one paragraph. Mark is reflecting back on the events of this story from 30 years later. So presumably when he was about 44, he was reflecting back on these events when he was 14. But yeah, I love that epilogue. That was another kind of just again being someone in interested in saints and all those kinds of things, and clergy and stories in general. That kind of I did like that. What did you think?
Well, so there's this interesting thing. I have Mark Aramini, the Wolf scholar, has talked about that. Like, he doesn't think that Wolf started out trying to make a brand as the unreliable narrator guy, but then like as he kind of got a reputation for it, that he started to lean into it more and more, especially with his later work. But it's interesting to me. I've been trying to just not like consciously think about, but just kind of in the back of my mind, like, okay, like why is this such a fascinating, like a subject of fascination for Wolf? And with Devil in a Forest, it's like this is told third person for the most part. There's not really a present narrator recounting the story. Although if you've read some of Wolf's books, you'll know that he can still find ways to play with unreliable narrator even in third person. Um, but with this, at the ending of it, you get an element of it. You don't really get an element of it. You get the question of it with that plaque at the fountain of like it's a similar thing to what he does with Severian in Book of the New Sun. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of scattered here, but I'm going to try and tie it all together. So with Severian, a lot of people are hesitant to trust him when he's like recounting his story, especially when he starts talking about like in one sentence he's talking about like how masculine he was and how he bedded all these ladies and and people are like, okay, sure, buddy. And then in the next sentence he's talking about, oh, and here's somebody who is dying and I used this relic and I healed them. It's like, okay, sure, buddy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think one of the things that Wolf is doing is that he's sort of putting a finger on uh, at the time he wrote it, 20th century, but now 21st century skepticism and the almost idolizing of rationalism, and that if we can't explain things rationally, then it must just be superstition. There must be nothing else to it. You know, sort of this idea that like any tradition, any rituals that we have, they're all just arbitrary things that people made up because they needed them. It's sort of a vein of that type of thought. And so with Severian, you get a lot of readers who will say, well, I just don't believe any of what he said. I've even heard people who've come up with these vast theories about like, so Severian is actually this guy locked inside of a madhouse who just imagined this whole story about him being this great hero, because they're that mistrusting of not just his claims of like the feats that he accomplished, but especially of the miracles. And so in the same way, at the end of Devil in a Forest, you get this plaque saying like, you don't see in the story the Abbe get healed. It sort of just ends with the Abbe being like, hey, can I go to the fountain? And the soldiers are like, no, we're not going to take you there. And the assumption is in the epilogue that Mark and his girlfriend presumably helped him and helped rehabilitate him, or however you would say it. But the only info you get on that is this plaque saying like, hey, and guess what, there was a saint here who got healed and worked other miracles. And your tendency of a modern rationalist materialist is to be like, oh yeah, sure, like that's probably what they believed, right?
Right.
And so I think Wolf is playing with a similar thing of being like, are you going to choose a path of faith or skepticism when it comes to the claims that are being made by maybe some of the miraculous figures in his story, which is why he wants to hide it in ambiguity so that you as the reader have the choice of faith. It's not like a Sanderson novel where it's all laid out of like, here's the algorithm the person used to achieve the supernatural. There is a question of it. So anyway, that's a lot of talking, but
No, I thanks for that, because I just sort of took the epilogue at face value and had, other than just, oh, here's these modern travelers that come across it, and here's what they thought about it, and here's what it said. But you're right, though.
well, and I
Yeah,
think,
that.
just to interrupt, I think it being modern travelers is especially like just pointing on that.
Mm-hmm. Right. You're right, though. I think there's a tendency in reading any of those texts from that. I mean, I'll imagine that the Devil in a Forest is a undiscovered text from 900 AD, describing these events. There's certainly, whether it's a hagiography about a saint or any other story from those time frames, there's sort of an automatic built-in skepticism
Right.
that I think we bring to the table when we read stories like that. Well, did that really happen? Did Saint Patrick really chase the snakes away from Ireland? Just to throw out a famous example, um, among lots of other stories like that. Did So I think that's a great insight into Gene Wolfe's writing. Again, I think he was writing. Again, I'm imagining him writing from this perspective of a person of faith, but dealing with faith in a very different context in, modern Western civilization in America, with technology that he worked obviously worked daily in his capacity as an engineer. Looking at these stories, was the Abe healed just because whatever had happened to him wore off and he got his eyesight back, like can happen periodically naturally? Was there a miraculous healing involved? What did it have anything to do with St. Agnes Fountain? Yeah, I think you're exactly right. He leaves all that open, I think, for the reader to um, think about, as well as all the other moral things that you raised earlier about, is Watt just a little more violent and rascally Robin Hood type character who's out there, doing some bad things but doing some good things as well? Is Mark a misguided youth who gets in with the wrong crowd and does some bad things and ends up getting people hurt because of it? Or is he ultimately a heroic character who does these things to protect the other people of his village and trying to do the right thing? Even the Abe himself, until the end of the story, you don't really get the sense, is he really a good guy or not here, based upon the way that some of the dialogue is transpiring. Their first part of the book, where they're trying to figure out what to do with this Watt, who is, terrorizing the area according to their way of thinking, and worst of all, costing them money because pilgrims won't come to St. Agnes Fountain if they think there's danger involved.
Right.
So, which is why this peddler shot in the neck at the beginning of the book is buried quietly and away from the sight of everybody else.
And
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, this is actually another example of, well, there's a couple of ways that this is sort of a pre-type of some things that are going to be played with in Book of the New Sun. For one, like Watt is very much the relationship between him and Mark is very much like a pseudo type of like Severian and Vodalus, and it doesn't take a lot of reading between the lines to see that. Bandit in the Forest, pseudo Robin Hood, you get that. I won't say too much because Jay, you haven't finished New Sun, but I'll say the element of actually no, you're far enough into this, so to Claw the Conciliator, this element of a character playing both sides of a conflict, sort of playing chess with themselves, which you have with Watt in here, who, it turns out he's actually like captain of the guard. You have a similar thing going on with, yeah, that's right, and you have a similar element of that with the Autarch in Book of the New Sun, where he's both, this emperor, but also is Vodalus's spy without Vodalus knowing it. But my favorite one that and once again, I didn't pick this out immediately. It took the Alzabo Soup guys pointing this out before I put two and two together, and it was like, oh, that's a similar thing to New Sun. Is that the innkeeper, I think, that gets injured, and they try to take him to St. Agnes's Fountain. They were like, hey, it's healing, we'll take you there. And he's sort of an agnostic on the whole topic of healing or not, and doesn't want to go because of, what that would mean for shaking up of his own worldview. And so he refuses it and doesn't want to go. And this ties into and this is never spelled out exactly in Book of the New Sun, but I think I'm right, which is this question of why does the healing Claw the Conciliator work at some times and not at other times? And people, this is another reason why people will say, like, oh, Severian's unreliable, because, like, sometimes it works and then sometimes it doesn't. And if you're just like, if this is actually a holy thing that you had, why wouldn't it just work all the time? And I think the reason why is, and I have my reasons for thinking this, but is in a similar way to Jesus in the Gospel of John has to ask the man at the pool if he wants to be healed before he can actually heal him. In a similar way, I don't think that the healing work of the claw works on people who do not want to be healed, which you have with, once again, spoilers for Claw the Conciliator, you have with Baldanders, who sort of like, on a philosophical level, opposes what that represents. And you have that with Jolenta, who's lost the will to live and dies at the end of the book. And you have a similar element of that with, once again, I forget which character it is that's dying in Devil in a Forest, but who also does not want to be healed by the work of the fountains. So
I think, yeah, Josellen's father is not given a name, I believe. I think he's just always referred to. Is that he was the innkeeper, right? I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. If I remember that story, part of the story correctly. Well, that's. I had not made. Thanks for making those connections. I had picked up on the Votalis or the Watt Mark connection and Votalis Severian relationship. I had not picked up on the other, or they weren't as obvious to me, and I didn't pick up on those. In particular, that one about the healing. That's very interesting. I think you're right, and that is a. It goes back to kind of a basic element of faith, and in a sense, is can people be healed? Can people be reconciled? Can people be brought to faith against their will? That's an open question in many different traditions. Every tradition probably answers that a little bit differently. But that's a great insight, connecting that to the story in John. Yeah, there are various parts in this story, The Devil in the Forest, where there are discussions about, do you believe? And at the end, Mark says, "Yeah, I do. I do believe. Just he also believes the Barrow Man is real. This mysterious spirit of the long dead warrior, but that doesn't preclude him from believing in Jesus and in the message that the Abbe, this priest monk, and had been sharing with him, as well as the story of the shrine, the Saint Agnes Fountain."
Well, because it's sort of like with what is it, Mother Clute with the witch, and for some brands of for some flavors of faith, like some people aren't going to like this, but there's a certain element where her methods, her witchcraft, sort of works, and that's why, like, I've been listening to so much Jonathan Pajot recently that it's like where my mind is at right now. But I was listening, because we're recording this near the end of October, I was listening to Pajot talk about Halloween, and he said, like, that's sort of what the Feast of Halloween is supposed to be, is that it's supposed to be followed by, I forget what the name of it is, my liturgical calendar memory is not good, but it's followed by a day of prayer. And so the idea is, yes, yeah. So the idea is, on Halloween, like, what happens? You have, this is symbolized by the children dressing up, but you have all the little ghosts and goblins come out, and they come to your door. And so what do? You put out the apotropaic images. You put out the skulls and the witches and the graves and the scary things to try to keep the monsters away. And it doesn't fully work. They still come, and you need to appease them with a little gift to get them to go away. But guess what? They're going to come back next year. And that's sort of what the feast is supposed to symbolize. And then the answer to that is supposed to be, the next day, All Saints Day, which is a day of prayer, being like, so this is like sort of the worldly, temporary, incomplete answer. And here's the fulfillment. Here's, if you want to think of it in the biblical sense. Here's the blood of Christ. Here's what actually is efficacious for salvation, even from demons and monsters and whatnot. And so there's a certain element of that that's at play. And I bring up the Halloween thing just as an example because it's cool and it's been on the brain. But there's a certain element of that of Mother Clute and some of her craft and some of her fortune telling. Something there is real that she's dabbling in. But also, guess what? Like it's not a full answer, and it ends up making her aligned with the Sparrow Man, with Watt, and it ends down a path that Mark and Jocelyn realize, oh, we don't want to go there by the end of the story.
Right, and they, thinking back to it earlier in the book, she's reading runes, and the rune stones, and comes up with the idea from reading these runes that, and accuses Mark of murder, because there's a murder that happens. There's murders throughout the book. This is probably I think the second one in the book that I'm talking about. And she ends up accusing Mark. So what does that mean? Does it mean that she's against Mark for some reason, making this up, or is she just reading the runes? Runes are true, or reading it incorrectly. I don't know if he answers that, but I think Wolf. Again, this goes back to the earlier conversation about are we, as postmodern people, looking back at, imagining this is a true story, looking at it and saying, well, all this witchcraft and healing powers of the St. Agnes Fountain, all these things, is that just superstition? And they were reading things into natural phenomenon, reading the supernatural into the natural, or was there really something to it? And the people of those times, who weren't as biased and jaundiced by our modern eyes and lenses that we are given because of technology and things like that, could they see things that we cannot see? Phenomena, that there are indeed those phenomena that aren't connected to the natural world. So I think, I think you're on to something there for sure. And I think that might be another element, going back to my earlier theory, that Wolf is almost writing this as an ode back to an earlier, simpler time when people did, in fact, have the ability to see these mysterious, supernatural things and not try to explain them away all the time. It's just what they were, and they could see what was happening, and they accepted it for what it was. I mean, I don't know. That's just my thought on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've got thoughts on a couple other things here with the book, but I also know I've been talking a lot. So Jay, I don't know if you have other things you wanted to bring up or that stood out to you here.
Go ahead. I think I'm sure I'll think of a couple of other things. Why don't you go ahead? I think that's most of my beans.
Yeah. So one of the Wolf is kind of a funny author in the same way of Tolkien, where you've got these you've got the ortho bros who love their stuff, but then you've also got the Wiccan crowd who's super into their stuff as well, and never the two shall meet. And so there's this conflict where a bunch of people will be like, oh, don't you know that Tolkien was a proto-pagan with some of his beliefs, which is complete nonsense. But for Wolf, the I guess the one that's been selected for Wolf is that he was secretly a Gnostic, or that he didn't take his faith seriously. It was sort of the trapping that he had to appease his wife, who was a Catholic, but really he was into some occultic stuff and Gnosticism. And I'm not saying that there's no evidence, because I'm not a biographer of Wolf. I have not seen evidence for that. So if a Wolf expert wants to prove me wrong, that's fine. I'm willing to have a conversation about that. From the accounts that I've heard from firsthand friends, people who knew Wolf, I haven't heard that. But the Gnosticism one is really interesting to me. I think we need to be careful attributing words that are put into characters' mouths to the author's belief. But when there's repeating themes that show up in an author's work, it sort of makes you think, okay, maybe this is somewhat indicative of their worldview. And there is a passage at the end of Citadel of the Autarch, so the fourth volume in Book of the New Sun, that is like a refutation, like whole scale of the idea of Gnosticism, um, which immediately that should like scratch your head and be like, huh, maybe I wonder why that one was picked for him. That seems kind of odd. And there's also a section in the middle of Shadow of the Torturer when they're talking about the three layers of symbolism that things have. That seems to be an argument with Gnosticism. But I bring up all that to say that when I was reading Devil in a Forest, there was a section here. And let me see if I got it here. Okay, this is where Mark is talking with the Abbe, and he says, so they're talking about. Um, okay, I'll just start reading, and it'll come out somewhere. So this is the Abbe. He says, it can still carry out its supportive function, which is why the body still lives, but its directive function is just as necessary. Unless he recovers soon, which I gravely doubt, he will die. He may quite possibly be dead by the time we get back to the tap room. You should prepare yourself for that. Mark asks, but his soul is really him, isn't it? And that will go on living. To which the Abbey replies, his body has just as much right to call itself by his name as his soul does. The Abbey corrected him abruptly, and his body will die and rot like a dog's carcass until our Lord calls it to live again. That is what we call death, the only meaning it has. His soul will exist forever, and I'm glad you've learned that at any rate. I hope you also realize that the continued existence may be in hell. And anyway, it goes on there, but there's just another example of where Gnosticism tries to divorce the physical, the material, the natural, and the supernatural, and say, there's a line, I just spoke about this with Andy Smith recently. We were talking about Canticle for Leibowitz, and there's a line in that where they says, no, you are a soul, but you have a body. You're not a body. You have a body, but you are a soul. And that's actually not technically correct, is that you are both. You are both fully body and fully soul. Like the Gnostics would say otherwise and would try to separate the two and highlight the spiritual and degrade that which is physical. And here, at least Wolf is putting into the Abbey's mouth a very traditional, I would argue, biblical reading of that relationship between body and soul.
Yeah, yeah. I remember. I don't have the page number of that passage, but as you're reading it, I remember coming across that and thinking, yeah, that is a very, very traditional reading. I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of theology with regarding to the last things, as they say, of our existence post life in this mortal coil. But yeah, there's been a long-standing dispute's the right word, but what is the relationship between the soul and the body? And you're right, it is we are a soul body composite. There is not there wasn't a pre-existing. This was actually a discussion in the early church. Was there before our conception? Did we have some sort of pre-existing soul out there disconnected from our body? No. We were created soul body when we were conceived and born.
Mm-hmm.
So which to me kind of ends that debate. And then again, at death, yes, there is, there's all kinds of things you could say about that, but what Wolf is clearly getting at there through that one line is that regardless of whatever you think of that soul body distinction and what happens at death on that, and on the last day, the general resurrection, whether it's the last judgment of Matthew 25, whether you're a sheep or a goat, what happens to you ultimately. There is it's your whole existence again. There's some sort of a resurrected existence of soul and body. We don't know what that looks like. We're given glimpses of that through the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, as well as the appearance on the mountain during the transfiguration. But right, that somebody who really wanted to read Gnosticism, that I suppose could somehow into the description of the soul in that passage. But to me, it sounds like Orthodox Christianity, or at least a character's version of it, writing from a 900s AD character's point of view.
Yeah, and once again, I don't claim to be a theologian, so I'm well open to being corrected if I am wrong. But I call it like I see it. Jay, I don't know if you have. Sorry, say what?
No, I think you're on the right track there. I mean, I'm not a theologian. I think I joked before and said I self-appointed myself the theologian of book 2, but I'm not. I know a little bit, but there's people who know a heck of a lot more than I do.
Well, I guess I wanted to ask if you had any concluding thoughts on the book as a whole, or anything that you wanted to leave the audience with here.
I think I'll just go back to my earlier point that if you are interested in reading Gene Wolfe, but you're not ready to bite off, a 5-book series, counting Earth of the New Sun is in the Book of the New Sun, or some of his other books, and you like tight, compact historical fiction books with maybe a little layer of the supernatural or fantasy involved in it, I think you would like this story. I've even seen it categorized timed as sort of a proto YA type book. I don't really know if I agree with that, but because I think they're just saying that because there's a 14-year-old as the lead character, and there's some violence, but not over the top. There's no swearing, there isn't as much sex, or really isn't any sex compared to some of the other Wolfe books, really. So I think I think it would be an okay place for somebody to start. It's, again, certainly not his masterpiece. It's not his best work, but if you're looking for something just to try him out, I think that this would be a decent place to start. And I think, again, it does offer some food for thought about some typical Wolfian themes about morality, about the role of religion and life, about the role of relationships between people, whether on a macro scale or a micro scale, within tiny villages or in a larger context of the society. So that's probably enough for what I have to say.
Yeah. Well, and I guess my concluding thoughts would be, I think it's also it would be an interesting read for people who have read a bit of Wolfe and want to see things that he's playing with in an early novel. In a similar way to if you read like The Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis, it's like nobody thinks that this is Lewis's best novel. But it's interesting to see sort of an early version of many of his ideas. And there's even some things from like Book of the Long Sun, some similar themes that Wolfe is playing with here, where you start out with a very small conflict that gradually expands as the book goes on, and suddenly what the initial conflict was seems very insignificant compared to what you're dealing with by the end of the book. So like I said before, it's not my favorite Wolfe book, but I think Jay's helped me enjoy it even more. And I think that you can see just from the fact that we've been yapping for an hour, there's a lot to chew on here, even in a small volume here. So yeah, I guess take Jay's word for it. If you're interested in Wolfe and want something that's a little bit more compact, a little bit less out there, on that. So I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I have it under my belt for sure. And I'm not getting rid of my copy. It's worth hanging on to. And who knows, maybe coming back to at some point in the future. But yeah, I guess that's all I have here. Jay, I guess I'll ask you as a concluding question. Do you have any plans to really read another Wolfe book? What do you have that you're got your sights put on for maybe a next read from him?
I think, I need to do my reread of Claw the Conciliator, because I have found that for me to do a analysis on my channel of anything from the Book of the New Sun so far, I need to read it twice. It's not saying that everybody needs to do that. So that's just me. So I did listen to in the summer. I listened to it via audiobook, and I need to reread it. So that's my immediate plan, is really continuing to grind away through Book of the New Sun. I have a few short stories left to finish in the short story volume of Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories. I would like to tackle Fifth Head of, just getting in, focusing on early Wolf for a while. I would like to tackle Fifth Head of Cerberus at some point. And I've got a sample of later Wolf through Pirate Freedom, and I enjoyed that. I want to keep working away through early Wolf in tandem with finishing off Book of the New Sun. What about you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I said I was going to read Sorcerer's House this year, and I don't know if I'm actually going to fit it in. I might have to punt that one to next year. So I do want to read the Sorcerer's House. But the one Wolf book that I'm for sure putting out there, that's like I want to read that next year, is Fifth Head, which even like I've heard even like Mega Wolf fans who are like, yeah, that one's tough. So I'm like, but it's exciting. It's I think even more sci-fi than the Solar Cycle, at least the New Sun books. So I'm excited to see what different sci-fi from Wolf looks like. But yeah.
Okay. Well, enjoy.
Yeah. Well, that's all I've got for today. Guys, go subscribe to Jay. He's been on the channel before and is sincerely one of my favorite people to watch on BookTube here. So Jay, thanks for reading a book with me. This was a pleasure.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I enjoy it as always.
All right, guys. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.